The Broken Arrow bar sat on the edge of town like a forgotten relic. Dim lights casting long shadows across worn wooden tables, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke that had seeped into the walls decades ago. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions, where the same faces showed up night after night, seeking nothing more than a cold drink and a few hours away from whatever waited for them at home. Behind the bar, Jenna wiped down the counter with mechanical precision, her eyes distant, watching everything and nothing at once. She'd seen it all in this place, the fights, the tears, the celebrations that always seemed to end in regret. Tonight felt no different. Just another Tuesday bleeding into Wednesday, another shift that would fade into all the others. At the far end of the bar, Paul was working on his third beer, his voice carrying across the room as he told some story nobody was really listening to. A couple of regulars nursed their drinks in the corner booths, their faces barely visible in the low light. The jukebox played something old and forgotten, the kind of song that felt like it had always been playing. It was quiet, routine, the kind of night where nothing was supposed to happen. But that was about to change. Before we begin, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love connecting with our community around the world. If stories about quiet strength, unexpected wisdom, and the true meaning of power resonate with you, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thought-provoking tale. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that real power comes from within, share this story with them. Sometimes the lessons we need most come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's step inside the Broken Arrow bar. The door exploded open with a force that made the hinges groan in protest. Every head in the bar turned as a mountain of a man filled the doorway. 400 pounds of solid muscle and barely contained aggression. He had to turn sideways just to squeeze through the frame, his shoulders scraping against both sides. The atmosphere shifted instantly, like all the oxygen had been sucked from the room. He moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew he didn't need to hurry, knew that no one in this place could stop him, even if they wanted to. Each footstep was a statement. Boots heavy against the scarred floorboards. His eyes swept across the bar like searchlights, cataloging every face, every exit, every potential threat. But his gaze kept returning to the door behind him, as if he was measuring it, calculating something the rest of them couldn't understand. Behind the bar, Jenna's hand froze mid-wipe. Her instincts, honed by years of reading trouble before it announced itself, were screaming at her. This wasn't their regular bouncer. This wasn't anyone she'd ever seen before. And the way he was looking at that door, not guarding it, but studying it, sent a cold thread of unease down her spine. She didn't move, didn't speak, but every nerve in her body was suddenly on high alert. Then, without a word, the massive man positioned himself directly in front of the entrance. His bulk consumed the doorway entirely, blocking out the streetlights beyond. He crossed his arms, each one thick as a normal man's thigh, and simply stood there, waiting. The bar fell into a suffocating silence. Paul's story died mid-sentence. The jukebox seemed to fade into the background. Even the clink of ice in glasses stopped. Everyone was watching, everyone was waiting, and in that terrible quiet, a single thought rippled through the room. What the hell is about to happen? The rumble of motorcycles cut through the silence like thunder, growing louder until it seemed to shake the very foundations of the Broken Arrow. Then, one by one, they appeared. 10 bikers filed through the doorway, and the massive bouncer might as well have been invisible. The first through was their leader, a tall man with a road map of scars etched across his weathered face. Tattoos crawled up his neck and disappeared beneath his leather vest. His eyes, cold, calculating, utterly fearless, swept across the room with the same predatory assessment the bouncer had made moments before. But where the bouncer had been searching for threats, this man was simply observing, taking inventory. Behind him, 9 more followed in disciplined formation. They moved like a unit, like soldiers who'd ridden together so long they didn't need words. Leather creaked, boots struck the floor in a steady rhythm, but there was no chaos, no wild energy, just confidence, pure, unshakable confidence. And they walked past the 400-pound wall of muscle like he wasn't even there. The bouncer's jaw clenched, a low growl building in his chest. "State your business," he rumbled, his voice like gravel being crushed. The leader didn't even break stride. He glanced over his shoulder, almost casually, and replied in a voice as smooth as whiskey, "We're here for the party, not trouble." Then he turned back around and continued toward the bar. The other bikers followed, fanning out, claiming seats with the easy certainty of men who belonged exactly where they were. They settled in like they'd been coming to this bar for years, signaling to Jenna, exchanging quiet words among themselves, completely ignoring the mountain of rage behind them. The bouncer's face darkened to a dangerous shade of red. His massive frame tensed, muscles coiling beneath his shirt like steel cables about to snap. He stepped forward, fully blocking the doorway now, his presence a wall of pure intimidation. "I said," his voice rose to a commanding bark, "you need to leave. Now." But the bikers didn't flinch, didn't turn around, didn't even acknowledge that he'd spoken. The leader caught Jenna's eye and nodded, a slight smile playing at the corner of his scarred mouth. One of the others leaned back in his chair, utterly relaxed. Another pulled out a pack of cigarettes, tapping one out with practiced ease. They acted like they'd been there 1,000 times before, like the 400-pound threat steaming behind them was nothing more than background noise. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the room. The power dynamic that had seemed so obvious, the massive enforcer, the group of potential troublemakers, suddenly wasn't so clear anymore. Behind the bar, Jenna found herself staring, her professional detachment cracking for the first time in years. She'd seen tough guys before, seen men try to posture and bluff their way through confrontations. But this was different. These bikers weren't trying to prove anything. They didn't need to. They simply were. And watching them dismantle the bouncer's authority without throwing a single punch, without raising a single voice, without even giving him the respect of their attention, there was something almost beautiful about it. Dangerous, certainly, but undeniably impressive. She caught herself wondering, who the hell are these people? And more importantly, what were they really here for? The bouncer's boots thundered against the floor as he moved toward them, each step deliberate, meant to intimidate. His shadow fell across the bikers like a storm cloud, and his breathing had turned heavy, audible. This was his final warning, his last chance to reassert control. "I'm not asking again," he snarled, positioning himself directly behind the leader's chair. "Get out." The leader didn't turn around. Instead, he raised a finger toward Jenna. "Whiskey? Neat. And whatever my brothers are having." Around the bar, the other bikers began placing their orders. Casual, unhurried, as if the 400-pound mountain of fury looming over them simply didn't exist. Jack and Coke. Beer, whatever's cold. Same. The bouncer's fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white. A vein pulsed visibly at his temple. He leaned down, bringing his face closer to the leader's ear, close enough that his breath would have been hot against the man's neck. But the leader just sat there, perfectly still, perfectly calm. Then, slowly, so slowly it was almost theatrical, he turned his head. His scarred face was inches from the bouncer's, and when he spoke his voice was quiet, controlled, absolutely certain. "We're not here to fight, we're here to have a drink. Move." It wasn't a threat, it wasn't even aggressive. It was simply a statement of fact, the way you might tell someone the sky is blue or water is wet, and somehow that made it 10 times more powerful. The whispers started then, rippling through the bar like electricity. Paul leaned toward the man next to him, muttering behind his hand. In the corner booth, 2 regulars sat forward, eyes wide, not wanting to miss whatever was about to happen. Even Jenna found herself holding her breath as she poured the whiskey, her hands steady despite the chaos building around her. The bouncer straightened up, his face now a mask of pure rage. His chest heaved. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to explode. "You think you're tough?" His voice rose, filling every corner of the bar, bouncing off the walls. "You think your leather and your bikes make you somebody? I will throw every single one of you through that door, and you won't." The leader picked up his whiskey glass as Jenna slid it across the bar. He took a sip, savoring it, then set it down with a soft click. The other bikers continued their conversations. One of them laughed at something his companion said. Another lit his cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his weathered features. They could have been sitting in a coffee shop for all the attention they paid to the massive man shouting above them. "You listening to me?" The bouncer's voice cracked with frustration. "Get out." Nothing, no reaction, no acknowledgement, no fear. The entire bar was waiting for the explosion, for fists to fly, for chairs to break, for blood to hit the floor, but it never came. Instead, something strange began to happen. The bouncer's rage, with nowhere to go, with no response to fuel it, began to deflate, like a balloon slowly losing air. His breathing was still heavy, his fist still clenched, but now there was something else in his eyes. Confusion, uncertainty. How do you fight someone who won't fight back? How do you intimidate someone who simply refuses to be intimidated? The leader turned slightly in his chair, enough to look at the bouncer directly. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. His eyes said it all. "We're not leaving." "And you can't make us." Another biker called out to Jenna, asking about the jukebox selections. Someone else commented on the game playing silently on the TV in the corner. They settled deeper into their seats, getting comfortable, acting like they owned the place. And in that moment, watching this impossible standoff unfold, Jenna realized something that sent a shiver down her spine. They'd already won. Without throwing a punch, without raising their voices, without doing anything except simply existing, refusing to bend, refusing to break. The question now wasn't whether the bikers would leave. It was whether the bouncer would finally understand that. The bouncer stood frozen, his massive frame suddenly seeming less imposing, more lost. His arms hung at his sides now, no longer crossed in that classic show of authority. His eyes darted from biker to biker, searching for something, a crack, a weakness, some sign that his presence still mattered. But there was nothing. For the first time in his life, his size meant nothing. His strength meant nothing. He'd built his entire existence on the simple equation that bigger equals stronger equals control. It had always worked. In every bar, every club, every dark alley, his physical presence had been enough. Until tonight. He could feel it slipping away, that invisible mantle of power he'd worn for so long. These men, sitting calmly at the bar, they weren't challenging him with their fists. They were challenging something deeper. His very right to command the room. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. How? The question echoed in his mind, louder than his earlier threats had echoed through the bar. He'd done everything right, established dominance, made demands, used his voice, his size, his presence, everything that had always worked. But they just sat there, drinking, talking, existing in his space like he was the one who didn't belong, and their calmness, that unshakable, infuriating calmness, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Vulnerable. "Did you see that?" Paul whispered, leaning so far toward his neighbor he nearly fell off his stool. "They didn't do anything, just nothing." "That's what makes it brilliant," someone else muttered from a corner booth. "They called his bluff without saying a word." The whispers spread like wildfire, quiet but electric. Never seen anything like it. Didn't even raise their voices. Just sat there and made him look like a fool. Behind the bar, Jenna's hands had stopped moving entirely. She stood perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with the clarity of someone witnessing a masterclass. This was psychology. Pure, elegant psychology. The bikers hadn't won through violence. They'd won through certainty, through an absolute bone-deep confidence that they belonged exactly where they were. They hadn't argued with the bouncer's authority. They'd simply ignored it, refused to acknowledge it existed. And in doing so, they'd made it disappear. It was like watching someone dismantle a bomb by refusing to believe it could explode. She found herself impressed. More than impressed. Genuinely in awe. These weren't thugs or troublemakers. These were men who understood something most people never learned. That real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't need to. It just is. And everyone around it has no choice but to recognize it. Time seemed to stretch, each second lasting an eternity. The bouncer stood there, paralyzed by his own confusion, his own growing realization that he'd already lost something he didn't know how to get back. Then, slowly, so slowly that at first no one was sure it was happening, he began to move, not forward, sideways. Step by step, his massive frame shifted away from the door, away from the bikers, until he was standing against the far wall. His shoulders sagged. His head dropped just slightly. The aggressive set of his jaw had softened into something that looked almost like defeat. He'd stepped aside. The doorway was clear. But the bikers didn't celebrate. didn't high-five or laugh or even acknowledge what had just happened. The leader took another sip of his whiskey. One of the others asked Jenna if the kitchen was still open. Another leaned back, finally lighting that cigarette he'd been holding. They acted like this was exactly how it was always going to end. Like there had never been any other possibility, because for them, there hadn't been. Jenna found herself staring at the leader, really looking at him for the first time. The scars on his face told stories of violence, of battles fought and survived. But his eyes, they were calm, measured, intelligent. These weren't just bikers. These were men who'd learned lessons most people never would, who'd been tested in ways she could only imagine, who'd discovered that the greatest strength wasn't in your fists. It was in knowing without doubt who you were, and being willing to stand in that truth, no matter who stood against you. What kind of people are they? She wondered, wiping down the bar with hands that had finally steadied. What have they seen? What have they survived to become this certain? The leader caught her eye and gave her that slight smile again, as if he could read every thought in her head. And maybe he could, because men like that, men who could win wars without firing a shot, they understood people in ways most never would. The Broken Arrow bar had returned to normal, conversations resuming, the jukebox still playing its forgotten song, but nothing was the same, and everyone in that room knew it. An hour passed, then another. The Broken Arrow bar settled back into its familiar rhythm. Drinks poured, conversations flowed, the jukebox cycled through its catalog of forgotten classics. The bikers had become just another part of the scenery, indistinguishable from the regulars except for the leather and the motorcycles parked outside. But Jenna couldn't stop thinking about what she'd witnessed. She moved through her routine on autopilot, pouring drinks, making change, wiping down the bar, while her mind replayed the confrontation over and over. Not a single punch thrown, not a chair broken, not even a raised voice, really. Just 10 men sitting down, ordering drinks, and refusing to leave. And somehow, that had been enough. She'd worked in bars long enough to know what real toughness looked like. She'd seen men throw their weight around, seen fights break out over nothing, seen egos clash in explosions of testosterone and broken glass. That was what she'd expected tonight. What everyone had expected. But these bikers had shown her something different entirely. Their power hadn't come from their muscles or their numbers. It had come from something internal, something unshakable. A certainty so deep that no external threat could touch it. They knew who they were, knew they belonged, and no 400-pound bouncer was going to convince them otherwise. It was confidence. Pure, undiluted confidence, not the loud, performative kind that needed to prove itself. The quiet kind. The kind that didn't need validation because it had already been tested and proven in ways she could only imagine. And in remaining calm, in refusing to meet aggression with aggression, they'd done something she'd never seen before. They'd won without fighting. Jenna paused, a glass frozen in her hand. When had she started thinking that staying calm was weakness? That the loudest voice or the biggest fist was the strongest? Maybe after years of seeing violence rewarded, of watching bullies get their way, she'd forgotten. The greatest strength isn't force. It's the ability to remain centered when everything around you is chaos. It was a lesson she hadn't expected to learn on a random Tuesday night. The leader pushed his empty glass forward, and Jenna moved to refill it. As she poured, he looked up at her, those calm, intelligent eyes meeting hers directly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply gave her a single, slight nod. And in that gesture, she understood everything. We don't need to fight. We just need to show them who we are. That was their secret. That was their power. They'd walked into a hostile situation and won it by simply being themselves. Completely, authentically, unshakably themselves. No pretense, no performance, just truth. And truth, she was learning, was more powerful than any threat. "Thank you," she found herself saying, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. The leader's scarred face cracked into a genuine smile, the first real one she'd seen from him all night. "Anytime," he said quietly, then turned back to his drink. That brief interaction told her more about these men than the entire confrontation had. They weren't here to prove anything. They didn't need to. They'd already proven it to themselves, in ways that mattered, in places far more dangerous than the Broken Arrow bar. And that made all the difference. Jenna's gaze drifted across the room to where the bouncer still stood by the door. He hadn't moved much in the past hour, just standing there, watching. His massive arms were crossed again, but the gesture looked defensive now, not threatening. And in his eyes, those eyes that had been so full of rage and certainty earlier, she saw something that made her chest tighten. Regret. He understood now, she realized. Understood what she was just beginning to grasp. That he'd tried to win a game he didn't know the rules to. That his size and strength, the tools he'd relied on his entire life, had been completely useless against an opponent who simply refused to play. The power dynamic in the Broken Arrow had fundamentally shifted. The bouncer might still have his muscle, might still physically dominate the room. But everyone here now knew the truth. Size didn't matter. Threats didn't matter. Only certainty mattered. Only calm mattered. And the bikers had both in abundance. The night wore on. Paul returned to his stories. The regulars nursed their drinks. The bikers laughed quietly among themselves, completely at ease. It could have been any other night at the Broken Arrow. Except it wasn't. Jenna moved through the bar, refilling drinks, clearing glasses, doing the same job she'd done for years. But she felt different, like she'd witnessed something important, something she'd be thinking about long after this shift ended. How many times in life did people try to force their way through situations? How much energy was wasted in confrontation, in aggression, in trying to dominate through sheer force of will? And what if there was another way, a better way? What if the real power was in knowing yourself so completely that nothing external could shake you? In being so certain of your right to exist in a space that no one could make you doubt it? It seemed so simple, so obvious, and yet so impossibly difficult. She glanced at the bikers one more time. They were getting ready to leave now, settling their tab, standing in that same organized, unhurried way they'd entered. The leader caught her eye one last time and tipped an invisible hat. Then they were gone, their motorcycles roaring to life outside, the sound fading into the night. The Broken Arrow bar was quiet again. But Jenna knew she'd never see power, real power, the same way again. Sometimes, she thought, wiping down the bar as the night finally wound down, the most extraordinary things happen in the most ordinary places. Sometimes a Tuesday night in a rundown bar on the edge of town can teach you more than a lifetime of looking for answers. All you have to do is pay attention. And maybe, just maybe, have the courage to be as certain in yourself as 10 bikers on a routine night out. The bouncer still stood by the door, silent, watching the empty space where they'd been. And Jenna wondered if he'd learned the same lesson she had, or if he was still trying to figure out how something as simple as confidence could change everything. If this story made you think differently about strength, confidence, and the quiet power of staying calm under pressure, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell us. Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone won without fighting? Where calmness defeated aggression? And if this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that challenge how we see the world, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that true power doesn't shout, it simply stands firm. Until next time, remember, the greatest victories are often the quietest ones. Stay strong, stay centered, and never underestimate the power of knowing exactly who you are. Thanks for watching.